It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to National Fund's virtual journey. For those of you who are new to Jewish National USA, you probably know we're planting trees and making the desert bloom, but we do so much more. We build medical facilities, housing infrastructure, parks, schools, and help people with disabilities. We also support economic development initiatives that pave the way for hundreds of thousands of Israelis to move from the crowded center of the country to the Negev and Galilee. The format of today's program will only allow participants to see the featured speakers. All participants are muted and they are unable to mute themselves. However, during the program, you can submit questions to the speakers through the Q&A feature. This program will be recorded. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to introduce you to a man who has devoted his life to building a stronger Israel for the next generation. He's an outstanding public servant who is in charge of promoting the efforts of Arab democracy, activists, and supporting Jewish leaders of tomorrow around the world during his service as senior policy advisor to Natan Sharansky in Israel's prime minister's office, when the famous Refusnik served as minister for Jerusalem and diaspora affairs. He's a passionate advocate for fair and accurate journalism who serves as director emeritus of Media Central, a Jerusalem-based project of honest reporting. He ran a decade that provides support services to foreign journalists in Israel, and who has written for publications including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Jerusalem Post. And after hiking the Israel National Trail, Israel's version of the Appellation Trail, he is inspiring author of My Israel Trail, Finding Peace in the Land of Milk and Honey. Now I turn over the program to Aryeh Green. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Amy and Russell and all the team at the JNF. I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I want to jump right in. So I want you to imagine, before we kind of talk about more general things and some of the lessons that I learned from the trail and some of the experiences I had, I want to jump right in and try and set the stage a little bit. So imagine, if you will, I'm on the edge of a cliff. I'm walking with a 50-pound pack on my back, with a side of a cliff to my left and a fall about 20 feet to my right, to the boulders below. This is somewhere up north. And I'm standing on the side of the cliff. I'm walking gingerly on the side of this cliff, and all of a sudden I come to the end. The path, the cliff, the path ends. I almost fall off because there's nowhere to go. And I start to panic. I start to panic because if I turn this way, my pack is going to pull me down onto the rocks below. If I start to turn the other way, the pack is going to bump up against the edge of the cliff. And yes, that's the cliff right there, a little bit further on towards the end of it. My pack's going to bump up against the edge of the cliff, and I'm just, I also could fall. I start to panic. I just didn't know what to do. So thank God for Thomas Crum and his book, 3 Deep Breaths. I took 3 deep breaths to try and figure out, to center myself, to slow down, to focus on what I really could do at this point. And I gingerly let the pack down. And I very carefully turned around, and I retraced my steps along that path. And I found, if you can put the picture up again for a second, Sarah, I found there on the side of the cliff, the point where the path actually had gone up the side of the cliff. And there were hand holdings, metal rungs that you're meant to climb up the side of the cliff. That's why I took this picture afterwards. I figured out where it was that I was supposed to go. Now, and that's just there on the left, which you can see in the picture there, where the path goes up under the overhanging leaves. Anyway, I traced myself back. I traced my steps then back to where you can see further along, just where the trail kind of disappears. That's where it fell off around the corner there, and basically found my pack. And I started to put the pack back on my back. And here's where something interesting happened. It felt somehow lighter. which made no sense. Nobody had taken anything out of the pack as I had gone back to try and figure out where the path went. But what was clear was nothing had changed in the pack. Something had changed in me, something in my attitude. I had changed. My sense of purpose, my sense of understanding where the path went meant or ended up leading to the pack just feeling lighter. And I retraced my steps gingerly and went on the way on the path. Now, this happened about 6 years ago. In February of 2014, I set out to hike the Israel National Trail. Shvil Yisrael, as it's called in Hebrew. 600 miles, about 1,000 kilometers, with a 50-pound pack on my back, as I mentioned. 2 months, 48 days of hiking. I didn't hike on Shabbat. It was a challenge, as it would be, I guess, for anybody, but especially a 51-year-old casual hiker. I mean, I did it at 51, not at 21, when at the time when most Israelis who are out going to hike the Israel Trail would do so. You can show a few more of the photos of the next photo, Sarah, just to kind of give a little bit of a feel, because that was the idea we had. I'll tell you where I'm standing in a minute. The idea is to share a little bit of a feeling for the hike on the Israel Trail. And you can imagine hiking 12 miles a day, day after day after day, alone with my thoughts. I had a tremendously uplifting experience. It was something which was both uplifting and moving, and gave me a chance for contemplation, and really, even more than that, a unique perspective on the history and the people and the vistas of Israel. Now, I want to share with you. You can stop with the pictures now, Sarah, and go to the next picture next time. I'm standing right now. You can see in the background a bit of the northern Negev desert. Now, what we're looking at are the hills of the northern Negev. The city of Arad is just over the range here. I can try and move the camera slightly to see if you can see. Unfortunately, you can't see quite as much as I was hoping we'd be able to, because I had to come in from the wind. I'm standing here protected by a little fence, because the wind now at sunset is so strong here in the Negev that you wouldn't have been able to hear me. But I'm here in Arad, and I chose to start our 3-part series of talking about the trail and the history and the land of Israel and the people of Israel. I chose to start here in Arad, not just because of the desert experience I want to share with you. And Sarah, you can share a few photos after I read a bit of a passage here. I decided to start with Arad because the connection that I felt as I was hiking the land of Israel, when I was hiking the Israel Trail, the connection with our people, with our history, was so very strong that I wanted to try and share that with you here. Now, you mentioned, or Sarah mentioned in her introduction, that the Israel Trail is Israel's version of the Appellation Trail. And of course, there are other hikes and treks in the world. You may be familiar with the Pacific Crest Trail out in California, or the Machu Picchu hike down in South America. Of course, in Nepal, there are treks and what have you, but none of those, not the Appellation Trail, the Pacific Crest, or any of the others, neither of them have the meaning, have the resonance for us, if we're Jews or if we're Christians or even not believers, Muslims or otherwise, and even if we're atheists, but we have a connection to the Jewish people, to the people of Israel. Hiking the land of Israel is a completely different experience than hiking the Appellation Trail or any other beautiful, wonderful scenic areas in the world. I want to read from the book. This is my book, My Israel Trail. And I don't often do this, but because we're here in Arad, I was reminded of the feelings that I had when I visited Arad. And I'm reading it to you just because it's a nice way of connecting my hike, the book, where we are, and our connection to the people of Israel and the land of Israel and the history, as well as, of course, the modern nation state of Israel. I'm just going to read a few sentences. As I walk around the uncovered lower city of the Tel Arad, the archaeological excavation of Arad this is, I'm surprised to read that it dates back 5,000 years to the early Bronze period. That's even before Abraham came to this land. And this part of the site wasn't built over, so it's in pristine condition to be looking at. Now, I saw living quarters, storage areas, walking down into a deep well, but even more than that, beyond the palace, I felt like I'm walking in a time warp. And I write here, I head up the path to the top of the tell. Arad's king attacked the children of Israel as Moshe led them toward the promised land, as described in the Hebrew Bible. After the Israelite victory, the city was named Hormah, destruction. But about 1,000 before the Common Era, or the late Iron Age, the city was resettled. And there are remains that testify to the importance of the city as a fortress, guarding the southern eastern edge of Judea. And it was amazed, I write here, that I moved by the almost palpable presence that I feel of those early Israelites, or Judeans, or Jews, I suppose, or Hebrews. I don't know what we would have called ourselves then. The archaeological site is almost alive. It's so well preserved and well presented. Here is a kitchen. Here is living quarters. Here is a defensive watch post, and here is a mikveh, the ritual bath, and another and another. And the mikvaot really make an impression on me, as if there's one thing that makes a dig in the land of Israel different than anywhere else. It's this proof positive, if any were needed, of the very Jewishness or Israeliness of a particular settlement, because no other culture really has such a construct, a ritual bath made in a specific way, situated in private homes throughout the village. That actually is something which I discovered up in Sipori in the north of Israel, and a number of different areas when I was doing the Israel Trail hike. And in, I think, the third episode of our series in 3 weeks, we may find ourselves, or in 2 weeks, we may find ourselves up near Sipori, if I can get up to the north to continue our conversation there. But I wanted to read that to you, and I wanted you to get the feel for this sunset time, even though there's wind here in the desert, the Negev, because I want you to not just listen to this as a story or as a description of my trail and the lessons learned. I want you to feel, if you can, even though it's a virtual journey, I want you to feel a little bit of the journey itself. And so because of that, I'm going to take a second, which is unusual when doing these kinds of discussions, broadcasts, webinars. I'm going to take a second to just listen to the quiet. And I want you to imagine that you're walking with me along the trail in the desert. Take a moment and just feel the silence. I realize that was only 10 seconds, but it's enough to get a feeling for the quiet of the desert. And that's one of the first things that I want to talk about. We have now 3 sessions that we're going to share. And what I'm going to be sharing with you is not just the views and the photos. You can show a few more photos now, Sarah, if you'd like, from the trail itself. But I want to talk a little bit about the lessons that I learned. What I didn't mention is that I took this hike for a very specific reason. Sarah, if you can put that onto the presenter's view, then we can see the whole picture and not the software PowerPoint. Thank you very much. I hiked the trail when at a very important and crucial, pivotal time of my life. And that was just after the finalization of my divorce, a divorce which I hadn't looked for, which was not my choice, and which literally turned my life upside down. And I was seeking to heal. And I meditated on mountaintops, and I cried in dry creek beds, and I wrote anguished journal entries and composed songs to lift my spirits. I looked back along the trail and inward and up to the night sky and over the valley to the next mountain range and down at the ants in the dirt, back along the trail to see how far I'd come. And what I discovered on the trail was a sense of self, a sense of personal and also national destiny, and a perspective of sorts on the human condition. In my search for inner peace while walking the land, I realized that many of these truths that were helping me on my personal journey could perhaps be helpful to others. And so to a certain extent, I started our conversation about that cliffside for a reason. I think it's something of a metaphor. Sometimes we have to take off our pack to find the path. Sometimes we have to offload our baggage, emotional baggage. Obviously, I'm referring to historical baggage, grievances. We have to sometimes, when we reach an impasse, try and imagine the alternatives that stand before us. Even if we feel that the alternatives are dangerous or unpalatable or frightening. The truth is, times of personal hardship test our mettle. Elie Wiesel, Viktor Frankl, and others took the personal and national horror of the Holocaust, of the Shoah, and translated their experiences into timeless lessons for humanity. For instance, Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, talks about having a goal, having an objective, having a purpose to give your life meaning. And so what I mean is that sometimes we have to set aside our baggage and reevaluate. And so for me, the trip was very much not just hiking the trail and discovering things about the land and the people of Israel and the history and what have you, but discovering things about myself or rediscovering some essential truths which come from our ancient wisdom in the Torah and from many other sources. Here's what I came to understand: that there are 5 primary elements, I think, which combined can create a framework for real peace and harmony, inner peace, inner harmony. I guess whether personal or natural. It's not new or particularly mysterious, but they together form the basis for my healing and for enabling me to move ahead with my life. And I want to share the first 2 of those 5 with you today, and then the other 2 I'll share in the next segment next week. And then in the last segment, we'll both go into the 5th element, which is probably the most important, and also kind of do a bit of a summary. But all of this is within the context, of course, of the actual experiences I had in the trail. Now, I'm going to take the phone, forgive the somewhat amateurish use of taking the camera, and I would like you to walk with me a little bit. I had some videos to show, and unfortunately, because of some technical issues, we weren't able to show videos. But I'm asking you to walk with me because I want you to get a feel again for what it feels like to be walking in the desert. Now, Sarah, you can write me a message. If you tell me that the wind here in the desert is interrupting the transmission and that you can't hear me, I'll understand, and I'll go back and stand in the area which is more protected. But it was important for me that you, as our viewers and participants, got a feeling for what I'm about to talk about. I want you to imagine, we took those 10 seconds of silence a little while ago just to give you a feel for the desert. But now I want you to imagine having a walk like this, walking minute after minute, hour after hour. If you can see my feet, I'm trying to show the walking along the desert, in the desert quiet. I'm going to be quiet for a second to share the contemplative and almost meditative rhythm of the hour after hour, day after day, walking through the desert. I think you're getting the feeling. And Sarah is suggesting it's too windy, so I'm going to be walking back now to the area that was more protected. I'm almost losing my keep up. But that was one of the ideas here that I hope everybody is enjoying and appreciating. One of the ideas was to make this a little bit different than your usual Zoom webinars. Not the JNFs, but everybody is doing Zoom all the time these days. And I'm not embarrassed with the relatively amateuristic elements of this, because this is meant to be more experiential. Now, the next 2 sessions, I'll make sure that the wind is less disruptive. But I hope that you're enjoying walking a little bit with me in the desert as we explore the kind of lessons that we can learn. And I want to start with the main lesson that I learned in the desert, that I spend two chapters of my book actually discussing, and that is desert humility. The humility that I learned walking day after day, hour after hour, just as we did together now, with that 50-pound pack. I mentioned that I had a 50-pound pack on my back. Walking in the silence of the desert, surrounded by nothingness, having no interaction with any other human being, sometimes not even with any animal, bird in the sky or beetle on the ground. That kind of repetitive, almost walking meditation filled me with a great sense of humility. It filled me with a sense of smallness, and that could have been overwhelming. That could have been depressing, but it wasn't. It was perhaps surprisingly liberating. It enabled me to put my problems, to put the challenges that I was facing personally, it enabled me to put them in perspective. Made me feel like I was part of a larger, wider universe. Now, returning to the other point that I made, when you're walking through the desert in the Mojave Desert in California, that can be beautiful in a certain way that only a desert can be. And you can have a similar feeling of aloneness. I was playing with words as I was walking. Aloneness, meaning all oneness. Connection with all the rest of humanity and the universe is what I felt in the desert. But what I wanted to return to is this theme of how unique it is to do so here in the land of Israel. And of course, those of you who are affiliated with the JNF and its connection, of course, to Israel and the Jewish people, the people of Israel, can understand this. I was walking through areas where the names of the dry riverbeds I walked through were familiar to me from the Hebrew Bible. The Midbar Tzin, the desert of Tzin. I walked through Nachal Tzin, a dry riverbed with the same name. Now, as far as I know, it's actually not the same Midbar Tzin, the desert of Tzin, that the children of Israel walked through, because that was down in the Sinai and I was in the Negev. And yet, the idea, the connection that I had with our people, with our ancestors, with our forefathers who had walked through the desert for 40 years as they made their journey, walking on their Israel trail from Egypt, from slavery to the land of Israel, to liberty, to freedom. I felt very connected to that. I felt connected to it as a Jew. I felt connected to it as an Israeli. I felt connected to it within the context that I was also kind of leading a form of let's call it unhappiness, sorrow, and pain. And then to move from there to my own freedom, my own new life, whatever my future would hold. Walking through the desert filled me with an incredible sense of humility. That was the first lesson that I learned. And the second lesson was something I also learned from an experience on the trail. And that was when I was hiking at one point, again, here in the desert, hiking in the Negev. I took a wrong turn and I started to climb up the side of a mountain. And I realized I wasn't going to make it to my night camp. And I was really angry at myself. And I sat down on the side of this very steep cliff. I was hiking hand over hand on these boulders that are basically the size that I am. I sat down, I took out my phone, and I was going to call my son to call Tesha, to call the IDF's emergency response team from the Air Force to come and pick me off the side of this mountain, because I didn't know what else to do. And instead of doing that, I said to myself, Aryeh, you're on the side of a mountain. This is on Har Shlomo, on Solomon's Mountain outside of Eilat. And I said, you're on the side of a mountain. And forget about whose fault it is that brought you here and what you're doing here. This is your reality. And you have to deal with that reality. You have to figure out what the next steps are from here. But the beginning of that is an acceptance of that reality. And for me, that was a pivotal moment. I ended up succeeding in finding my way to my night camp that night, fortunately, without too much additional effort. There are more stories that I could tell without question. Sorry, I went off camera there for a minute. There are more stories that I could tell about that day, which of course I go into more detail in the book. But that night I wrote in my journal how important that issue of acceptance was within the context of my life, not just on the trail. I wrote, and I remember thinking that, sitting in my tent there in the hills of the southern Negev in Eilat. You're divorced. That's your reality. And just like sitting on the side of that mountain, accepting the reality you found yourself in, and then trying to move on from that, you have to accept the fact that you never expected yourself to be divorced. Now you are. Accepting that is such a crucial element of being able to move forward. There's that pithy aphorism, which I can never quite remember properly, about changing, about having the acknowledging that there are aspects of your life that we have no control, about accepting the things that I cannot change, and having the wisdom to know the difference between those I can change and can't. That pithy aphorism really does sum it up. Acknowledging that there are aspects of our life that we don't have in control. And the truth is that we have sources in our tradition that relate specifically to that issue. And the sources include Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, who was very much not only humble, which is important, but also was very, very accepting of both the role that he was given and also of the limitations of the children of Israel and their complaints. He wasn't always accepting, by the way, but there was that element within his role of leader of the Jewish people. And the truth is, we have also other traditions that relate to both acceptance and humility that I could go into more detail of, one of which is Elijah, and his experiences in the desert, listening to the still small voice of God on Mount Sinai, which these were thoughts also which reverberated within my mind as I was walking day after day and contemplating, all of these issues. So basically, yes, Sarah, you can definitely share a few more photos. I'm happy to because we haven't had the chance really to walk around enough in the Negev, that you can share a few more photos from the trip. I want to sum up the two issues that we're talking about here and describe this. For instance, is a picture near the top of Har Shechoret, of Mount Shechoret, one of the southern Negev mountains, and this is Ma'alei Palmach, a lovely place near the Karbolit, the hardest day on the trek, which I think there'll be a picture of coming up. There were times during the first 3 weeks that I spent in the desert where these issues, these ruminations on humility and acceptance reverberated even more than you can imagine. You can go to the next photo, Sarah, and the next few, and I'll describe what we're looking at so that people can appreciate. So this is the Karbolit. You can see behind my face what looks like the crow, the crest of a rooster. And this is known as the hardest day on the trail. And because you're walking along the edge of that cliff, and the winds, which you felt here tonight a little bit, are kind of half blowing you off the cliff. It's a very, very hard hike to the top and then down. but it definitely, let's remain on this photo for a minute if you wouldn't mind, Sarah. It definitely was one of the days where I had to have an abundance of humility and acceptance to suffer the grueling challenge of that carbolet. Now here what you're looking at is something fascinating, and if you're familiar with the JNF, you may be familiar with many of the nature reserves that are throughout the country. You're looking right now at the largest nature reserve in Israel. I'm sure you've never heard of it. It's called the Judean Desert Nature Reserve. And the reason you've never heard of it, and most people have never heard of it, is that there's nothing there. Look at the photo. There are small gray and black rocks and brown dirt as far as you can see. I walked for 8 hours all alone through this Judean Desert Nature Reserve on the Israel Trail and didn't see a single soul. And the reason that I thought it was important to share that particular photo with you is not only to demonstrate the stark nature of some elements of the hike here in the northern Negev. It's actually just south of here, south of Arad, this Judean Desert Nature Reserve, but also to reinforce the discussion that we had earlier about the resonance of the silence of the desert. If Elijah heard a still small voice on the top of Mount Sinai, many of our prophets found inspiration in the desert. And King David escaped to this Judean desert when he was running from Shaul HaMelech, from King Saul. I'm no prophet, but there's no question that in that day of hiking through this, what you're looking at in that picture, the Judean desert, Sarah, you can move on to others. I experienced something of a revelation. Some of these ideas that I'm sharing with you about humility and about acceptance came to me even more powerfully there on that date. In fact, on that day, I wrote a song for the first time in 35 years. It was really a transformative, pivotal moment or time or day in the trail and in my healing in meeting my own personal challenges, because basically not having any contact with anything from the animal kingdom, vegetable kingdom, anybody else, humans or anything else, it made me feel literally one with the universe. And I'm not embarrassed to share some hyperbole. That, to a certain extent, it kind of sums up those first 3 weeks that I spent in the desert, within the context of these two specific lessons that I learned. I'm going to kind of close at this point and take questions and happily answer your questions or take some comments. I hope that I've given you a feel for, a little bit at least. The wind has died down. I think we can take a walk again. A feel for the Negev, a feel for the beginnings of the Israel Trail, a feel for what my experience was walking through the Israel Trail, at least for those first 3 weeks in the desert. Next week, we're going to be, I think, in the Jerusalem hills, where not only will the wind be less, but we'll see a little bit more of the scenery that you may be familiar with of Jerusalem. And we'll be talking next week about the next 2 lessons that I learned, which they're not a secret because you can go to the website for my book and see them there, or read about them otherwise. The next 2 lessons that we'll talk about next week are gratitude and appreciation for the things, the blessings that we do have in our life, and forgiveness, the importance of forgiving those who harmed us or even perceived grievances. There's the 5th element we won't get to until our 3rd session in another 2 weeks. But hoping that you'll join me, I'll give you a hint that it relates to what I was saying at the beginning of relating to Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, and the importance of having goals and objectives in life to give to give your life meaning. Sarah is sending me on chat some questions, so I'll happily answer questions, and I'm going to keep walking a little bit, but I understand that it's still a little bit windy, so giving you a little bit more of a feel for what it looks like at sunset here in the Negev. I'm going to walk back to where we're a bit more protected in a minute. So one of the questions that somebody asked is what advice would I give for people thinking of hiking the trail? Well, thank you for asking, because first of all, I want to say, clearly, if you're affiliated with the JNF and watching this program, you have some affinity for Israel. You may well have visited here before. I would imagine that most visitors have not taken the opportunity to hike the Israel Trail. And I would encourage you, I encourage everybody to hike the trail in order to experience a little bit, even just a taste. You can hike for an hour. You can hike for a few hours, or a morning, or a day, or a few days, and find yourself moved, as I was, by the different connections. My advice would be, first of all, to buy the red guide, the informal, unofficial guide to hiking the trail. My advice would be to read up. There's a wonderful website called Hiking the Holy Land, which I can highly recommend. There are a number of websites that focus on the Israel Trail that you can Google and find. And I'm certainly very happy to give advice if people are looking for ideas. Some of the advice, though, would differ for somebody thinking of hiking the entire trail as I did in one shot all alone, versus those interested in hiking for a day or two, or an hour or two. There are also groups that you can join to hike the trail. And so my advice would be to prepare well, and to make sure that you're well supplied, and also to connect with some of the groups that you can hike, because hiking with a group sometimes is either as or more enjoyable, depending, of course, on what your situation is. If you're not facing a personal challenge and need some solitude, then it can be a wonderful camaraderie to hike with a group, which I did do once or twice in the course of the trail. I just want to point out, I'm stopping for a second, that behind me now you can see, because the wind has died down, I'm pointing to Tel Arad, to the archaeological site of Tel Arad, which I was describing at the beginning when I read from my book. It doesn't look as interesting, I suppose, as it is to actually walk around it. But that would be the other bit of advice that I would give, is that the usual trips to Israel and the usual places that people visit, while beautiful and uplifting and wonderful, I do believe you can augment a trip to Israel in a very powerful and emotional and inspiring way by including on your itinerary at least a stop or two on the Israel Trail. I'm just looking at the chat very quickly to see what other questions people might have. Thank you for another question. What kept me motivated to continue day by day? Well, to a certain extent, I was talking a little bit earlier about man's search for meaning and Viktor Frankl and having a goal. Well, clearly, I had a goal. The goal that I had primarily was to hike the Israel Trail. And that was a goal that I had set for myself, primarily because the goal that I had was to recover and to heal from my devastating divorce. I had to get my life back on track, and this was an opportunity, or this was a way that I chose to find a way to get my life back on track. And so that was my primary goal. And as that goal, that kept me motivated. And it was something that I just wanted to achieve. I had never hiked like this. I was a casual hiker, a day or two here, maybe an overnight when I was in college or camp counselor in California, or with my kids growing up in Israel in the last 35 years. But it was a real physical challenge, but it was an emotional challenge also to have this solitude. That kept me going every day. And having the goal every day of getting to the night camp, finding the place that I had my water drop was an important way that I helped myself to keep motivated. I sung a lot to myself. I talked to the trail signs, you know, the three colored signs that you might have seen in one or two of the photos, which direct you, and the trail marker that I missed on that cliff and had to go back. I missed the trail markers at least a few times every day. One of the motivating ways that I kept my spirits up was to talk to the trail signs, like the character in the movie Castaway. Tom Hanks, he talks to the ball, Wilson. So I talked to the trail markers, and I would greet them like an old friend. Oh, there you are! When I saw it, so I knew that I was on the right path. And there's no question that the support of my family, my children, my parents, my very close friends who are my family here in Israel, kept me going every day. But the truth is that because I was facing this specific personal hardship, I think what kept me going every day was the feeling that I had that I was just moving, that I was physically moving and striding ahead every day to reach that night camp, to reach whatever the point was that I was going to take a rest. That kept me going because it was just part of this psychological need that I had to keep on moving. I think I should close there. I know that our time is a bit running out. I hope you'll join us next week in the Jerusalem Hills to talk about gratitude and forgiveness. And I hope you'll join us the week after, probably on the beach at the Mediterranean Sea, to talk about all the possibilities that are open for us, and to talk about having goals and objectives in life. But thank you very much for joining me. Thank you to the JNF and Sarah and the whole team there. This has been On the Trail with Aryeh Green. I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you. Thank you, Aryeh. I really appreciate it. It was wonderful. Please turn in for the next 2 Thursdays at 12 p.m. Eastern to hear more about his journey on the Israel Trail. During this time of social distancing, Jewish National Fund wants to help you feel closer to Israel. If you like today's call, please tune in for the next 2 weeks, but also you'll love our podcast. You'll love our podcast as well, Israel Cast, a show featuring inspiring guests from the land of Israel. New episodes come out every other week at jnf.org/IsraelCast, or simply Google Israelcast. You can also stay engaged and connected by watching other great Jewish and Israel related content at youtube.com/Jewish National Fund. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Bye.